Hello, I'm Paul Brooks, and I'm with you today to discuss this week's Sunday School lesson about Imprecatory Psalms, Seeking Justice. This is the third lesson in our spring quarter in this first unit, Scriptures Difficult to Understand. Well, imprecatory psalms or prayers are those which invoke God to execute His vengeance against the ungodly. What we learn in this lesson is that we are to leave vengeance in God's hands while doing all the good we can to help others come to the Lord, including our enemies. A way to begin this for the ancient Jews was to pray for vengeance while placing it in God's hands. Remember that the Jews suffered terribly, and they were seeking justice as much as vengeance. Jesus and others taught from the Old Testament morality. They did not change it, but helped us to understand it more completely. There's a lot of help in this lesson to understand difficult passages, imprecatory passages, and it's impossible to cover in just 10 minutes. This requires that you read the lesson scriptures and other supporting material provided for your lesson this week. The central truth this week is that God commands that we do right and that we trust Him to do right. Our focus should be to ascertain the true nature of the imprecatory psalms and leave vengeance in God's hands. The evangelical emphasis for modern Christians this week, the message we should share with non-believers, is that Christ's saving grace more than compensates for wrong suffered in life. This lesson is in our standard 3 parts, covering scripture from several imprecatory psalms and other scripture to help provide better understanding. At one time or another, each of us has experienced betrayal and mistreatment. Someone has lied to us, cheated us, abused us, or persecuted us unjustly. What should we do when we're treated unfairly? In this lesson, we will learn the appropriate Christian response to these and other kinds of mistreatment. In part 1, we read from a captivity psalm, Psalm 137. It was written during the most difficult and distressing event of the entire Old Testament and in the history of Israel as a nation. In verse 1 through 6, the psalmist cries out to God, relating the suffering of God's people and how they were dealing with it. In Psalm 137, verses 7 to 9, we read the prayer that justice will prevail. This is the kind of violent prayer that makes us uncomfortable today. But in reading it, while keeping in perspective the times and practices during this period, we see the psalmist asking God, bottom line, for justice. There are 6 points to keep in mind while trying to understand the value of prayers like this psalm. The psalm reflects every kind of human emotion and condition, both positive and negative, reflecting the deepest desires of the oppressed and suffering community. Point 2, the violence of Psalm 137 in verse 8 must be understood in its cultural context as a poetic exaggeration that was never intended to be taken literally. Point 3, these are prayers offered to God by the people of God. There is no indication that God is called for this kind of prayer, and we're never told to pray in this way. Point 4, these psalms reflect a world of violence, and they articulate a hatred of injustice and a hunger for a proper world order. Point 5, the psalmist does not intend to personally harm any babies. The prayer is a way for the psalmist to get out the desire for vengeance, stated in general terms and then left up to God. Uttering these needs or desires to God in prayer allows for the pain to be let go, giving it completely to God. This allows us to express our deepest emotions while acknowledging God as the judge and executor of justice. And finally, point 6, we should pray for the destruction of evil institutions and practices. These types of prayers belong in the believing community, where they express the desire for God's justice to be done in earth as it is in heaven. Then in part 2, from Deuteronomy, Romans, Hebrews, and Psalm 69 and 109, we seek to understand prayers for God's vengeance. The prayer in Psalm 137 is based on the belief that God will punish all evil. Before we look at 2 more prayers for vengeance we find in Psalm 69 and 109, let's examine the Bible's teachings on divine vengeance. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35, and then verses 41 to 43, we learn that vengeance belongs to God. And know that this is absolute, because God rules over the world and ensures justice. He will bring to an end the prosperity and security of the wicked. We can take comfort in the fact that God's justice exists in parallel to his mercy. We see in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43, that as surely as he will punish evil, God will be merciful unto his land and to his people. In Romans chapter 12, verses 19 to 21, and Hebrews chapter 10, verse 30, we begin to see the New Testament perspective. It's clear from these passages that the New Testament perspective is actually the same as the Old Testament perspective. Vengeance belongs to God, and Christians should not attempt to avenge themselves. Christians are commanded to do good towards their enemies. By doing good, the Christian is victorious, defeating evil. So be cautious, because God's justice extends to his own people. Judgment begins at the house of God. We must be diligent to maintain a humble spirit and trust in God's grace. In Psalm 69, verses 22 to 28, we read prayers for vengeance on persecutors. In this passage, the psalmist prays for God's help in dealing with his enemies. The psalmist has been troubled by his enemies, and his enemies have demonstrated an uncaring attitude towards the weak. Again, the psalmist pours out his feelings to God while placing the issue in God's hands for judgment. In Psalm 109, verses 6 to 20, we read prayers for vengeance on abusers. The psalmist once again brings his burdens to the Lord in prayer. He feels betrayed and abused by people he thought were his friends. Does that sound familiar? Well, we find that ultimately the sin of this enemy was that he abused people who were weak or in a weakened state. The psalmist prayed that this person receives what they gave out, or in other words, the punishment should be equal to the crime. Finally, in part 3, from passages in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Proverbs, we read about Old Testament morality. Many readers justify the violence in the Old Testament as being a different, inferior morality to that of the New Testament. Not so. From Exodus chapter 23, verse 4 and 5, and Leviticus chapter 19, verses 14 to 18, we see that we don't act hatefully. The basic moral principles of the New Testament were already found in the Old Testament, and many of the New Testament teachings on morals are quotations from the Old Testament. Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself, borrowing from the Old Testament. Next, we learn don't take pleasure in the suffering of others, from Proverbs chapter 24, verses 17 to 18, and Proverbs 25, verses 21 to 22. The inner attitude of care and concern for one's neighbor is clearly displayed in chapter 24, verses 17 to 18. Loving our neighbor means that we will never take pleasure in their suffering, even if we think they deserved to suffer. Both Jesus and Paul alluded to what is found in Proverbs 25, verses 21 to 22, to be kind to our enemy. In doing so, we will be victorious over evil, and the Lord will reward us. This lesson challenges us to love our neighbor, even when our neighbor has harmed us. Even if our neighbor deserves to suffer, we should not rejoice in that neighbor's misfortune. This kind of love comes only from God, who loves us and does not rejoice in our suffering, even when we have brought that suffering upon ourselves. We have never deserved God's love, yet He loves us without reservation. God demonstrates His own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died from us, from Romans chapter 5, verse 8. Let us go forth and bless our neighbor as we display God's powerful love. Be watching for several video posts next week as we continue our next Sunday School study of Scriptures Difficult to Understand. Our next lesson is titled Puzzling Sayings of Jesus. We will focus on the central truth that Christ desires us to discern, understand, and apply His teachings. So thanks for joining me in this video. And as always, I pray that God will bless you while keeping you and your loved ones safe.